Hello and welcome. Thank you everyone for joining us to commemorate World Day Against Child Labor. I'm Judy Gearhart. I'm a research professor at American University. I'm also the chair of the International Committee for the Child Labor Coalition. I want to start by thanking our co-hosts for this event, which are the Child Labor Coalition, the Campaign to End U.S. Child Labor, and the Global March Against Child Labor. I also really want to thank our two co-leads of the Congressional Child Labor Prevention Task Force, Representatives Skolton and McGarvey. We are so grateful for your leadership on this issue, and I mean that from the bottom of my heart. Having worked on this for decades now, what you do in Congress really matters, especially right now. During the next hour, we are going to review some core elements of the fight to end child labor, and we're going to assess the very real risks that we're facing right now, that we may see major increases in child labor, both in the US and abroad, if we don't continue this fight and really double down. This is going to be a masterclass all inside 1 hour. We want to thank our speakers and invite everyone to put questions in the chat. We may not have time for Q&A, but the speakers and the co-hosts are committed and will be happy to reach out to you afterwards. So please include your questions, include your emails. We want to be in touch. So the fight to end child labor is very much one that requires continued vigilance. This is something that the US Department of Labor's International Labor Affairs Bureau has been leading for decades. ILAB has been pivotal in the fight to end child labor, something that Congress has made possible with important budget allocations. This is a leadership role the US needs to maintain going forward. In 2002, when the UN declared the need for the World Day Against Child Labor, there were 246 million child laborers. In 2015, we reduced that number to 151 million. But over the past decade, that number has basically plateaued, and we're at 138 million child laborers today. And I want to be clear, this is not children working in their family's business or getting up at dawn to deliver papers like my brother and I did. This is the kind of work that makes it difficult or impossible for kids to continue school. This is often dangerous work that can result in permanent injury, such as children wielding machetes as long as their arms in cocoa fields, like you saw on the slideshow. It's children making bricks in India, which is backbreaking work, or it's children poisoned by green tobacco sickness, walking among tobacco plants taller than they are in the US, or children who slip on the killing floor in a meatpacking plant, as Hannah Dreier from the New York Times wrote about, and her investigative reporting won a Pulitzer Prize last year. If you haven't read her articles about child labor in the US, please do. That is my high-level intro of how this hour is going to work. And I want to start by introducing our co-lead on the Congressional Child Labor Prevention Task Force, Representative Skolton. Thank you very much for joining us. Please take it away.
Can you all hear me?
We can hear you.
Okay, fantastic. There was some muting and unmuting that was happening. I wanted to make sure you could hear me okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Congresswoman Hillary Skolton. I represent Michigan's 3rd Congressional District in Congress, the first woman and mother in history to represent the western half of our state, including the Upper Peninsula, in Congress. I'm joining from my apartment in DC today because I have my son here with me in Washington, DC. I want to thank our partners from the Child Labor Coalition, Campaign to End U.S. Child Labor, and Global March Against Child Labor for hosting this briefing, as well as my colleague, Morgan McGarvey, who has just joined me in this fight. Vulnerable children are slipping through the cracks, both in the United States and around the world, and we have a responsibility to work together to protect them. I'll never forget walking out of the very first town hall that I did as a newly elected member of Congress, and my phone just absolutely was alight with text messages asking, have you seen the news reports? Have you seen the news reports? And it was the expose by Hannah Dreier, of course, about the untold story of child labor exploitation in the United States of America. The dateline was Grand Rapids, Michigan, my district. I knew in that moment, that action had to be taken. My very first thought as a new member of Congress, not fully realizing the weight of my responsibility, was, someone should call their member of Congress about this. As it settled in that that was me, I got immediately to work, and filled in the gaps that my lifelong career of advocating for children as a social worker and working on immigration issues as an attorney had prepared me to do. I called the White House. We got an interagency task force established, then later funded, and we stood up this task force in Congress as well. I worked with former Representative Dan Kildee to create this child labor prevention task force. Morgan has now taken over his role here, and we joined forces to send a letter to the Secretary of Labor, encouraging the administration to continue to root out the causes of child labor exploitation in this country and around the world. We know, of course, a huge cause of that is our deeply broken immigration system that allows children to exist in the shadows that that system creates. Child labor is not a new issue. It's been around so long that we've had the laws on the books since the early 1900s to protect them. The problem is with enforcing them and making sure we understand how and where this is happening. It is so important that we have opportunities like this today to identify where the weak points are so that we as members of Congress can address them and fix them. Thank you again to our partners for facilitating this and your tireless work to protect kids around the world.
Thank you, Representative Scholten. I'm sorry, I was also having the same unmuting problem on my end. But thank you for joining the fight, and thank you for your leadership on this issue. We really appreciate you and Representative McGarvey taking this up. So yeah, we imagine you, yeah, we know you have a busy schedule, and we really appreciate you putting this together with us. The next speaker we have is Jessica Luman. Jessica is the former administrator of the Wage and Hour Division at the Department of Labor. And I have to say, the work that the Wage and Hour Division at the Department of Labor has done over the years has been, I mean, it's God's work, really. It's just like Hannah Dryer's work wouldn't be possible. We couldn't shine a light on these issues if we didn't have the backup of steady stream government data and investigation. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much, everybody. Good. Okay. Really appreciate the opportunity to be here. Want to echo everything that Representative Scholten just said and just thank her for her leadership on this incredibly important issue. And as she said, most people became aware of the realities of child labor exploitation in our economy over the last few years. This is after we learned about the terrifying realities of the Packer Sanitation Services Company employing more than 100 children, some of whom were as young as 13, to clean the kill room floor on the overnight shift at meatpacking facilities across the country. And we learned about it after the threats of violence and wage theft and hazardous employment of children in poultry companies in California. And we learned about it after the tragic death of a teenager in a Wisconsin sawmill, and the injuries suffered by children who fell off roofs or who were maimed by machinery. But we all know that after is too late. And ending the exploitation of children is one of the top priorities that has to be for everyone in our economy, including it was a top priority for us in the US DOL over the last 4 years. The department's Wage and Hour Division is the part of the government that is responsible for enforcing the federal child labor laws. And over the last 4 years, we worked really hard to leverage all available enforcement tools to protect children from illegal child labor and also to hold employers accountable when they employ children in violation of federal child labor laws. The Wage and Hour Division concluded over 3,300 cases involving child labor violations in the last administration, finding more than 17,000 children were employed in violation of those laws. And the Wage and Hour Division assessed more than $38 million in civil money penalties against employers over the last 4 years. And as we left the Biden administration and as we started this year, the Wage and Hour Division still had more than 900 child labor cases under investigation. And just, I want to be really clear that the increases that we saw in the amount of child labor violations and the CMPs and the ways we were able to hold employer accountable are a direct result of DOL's increased emphasis on identifying child labor cases and bringing strong enforcement actions when it found companies violating the law. So I think that, as Representative Skolton said, that connection between having good, strong laws but also enforcing them, that is critical to making sure that we are addressing this issue. So what is working? What is working in addressing child labor across the United States? Well, one of the things that's working is raising awareness that child labor is not a 100-year-old problem, but a today problem in our country. Also working is the whole of government approach that Representative Skolton talked about, that this effort of pulling all of the levers to prevent and address child labor, whether it be in schools, whether it be outreach, education, awareness, training, giving employers the tools that they need, but also making sure that everyone who cares about kids has the information they need in order to protect those kids from child labor. What also is working is holding employers accountable for employing children in violation of those laws. And that may mean that we raise awareness. That may mean that we issue civil money penalties, but it also may mean that they get in the newspaper. What also is working is the industry leadership in developing strategies to prevent child labor. I will give a lot of credit to a lot of industries who have taken notice, who are taking this issue very, very seriously, and are bringing forward tools for their industry, for their sectors, to help prevent child labor from ever occurring in the first place. And then what also is working is union engagement and worker voice. At the end of the day, this is really about safe workplaces. This is about making sure that kids aren't working in workplaces that are hazardous to their own health, but also not making workplaces themselves less safe because there are children employed there. And we are incredibly proud of some of the work that has happened across unions who have really engaged in this area, and then also, again, empowering workers to speak up and speak out when they see that there are violations of all labor laws, but particularly when they think that children may be in danger of working in hazardous workplaces. And then what's not working? Well, I'll tell you what's not working. What's not working is blaming children. And we unfortunately see a lot of that happening as making excuses around what are the root causes? What are the ways that this is happening? What is not working is blaming children instead of blaming employers for employing children in violation of the law. So we made a lot of progress in the last 4 years, but here we are. And we know that there are really new challenges that we have to face to meet the moment. So first, we are seeing these children who have died. We're seeing children permanently disabled. And it is irresponsible for us to even contemplate protecting children less in this country. And yet we know that there are bills in Congress and that states are rolling back child labor protections, which is not only dangerous for children, but it also makes it much more difficult for employers to comply with the law and for high road employers to do the right thing. Second, we also know that there are only 611 investigators at the Wage and Hour Division as of May. These same investigators enforce minimum wage, overtime, FMLA, and child labor laws. These 611 investigators are responsible for protecting 165 million workers at 11 million workplaces. And there is no way an underfunded Wage and Hour Division can meet this moment. And the Trump administration's request to cut funding of the Wage and Hour Division by $25 million is irresponsible. But the biggest challenge that is facing us today is that we lose all of the momentum we have gained, the awareness we have achieved, and the protections that we have put in place. The biggest challenge is that we don't continue to hold ourselves, our communities, our sectors, our industries, our economy, our employers, each other accountable for making sure that child labor is no longer an issue in the United States. And we just need to make sure that we don't go backwards. So I really want to thank everyone for the opportunity to join you today to lift up this really critical and important issue. I'm happy to answer any questions, but Judy, I'm going to turn it back over to you. And again, thank you all for all of your work.
Thank you, Jessica, for yours. And thank you, Representative McGarvey, for joining us. We really appreciate your leadership in this fight. And just want to remind people to please put questions and your emails in the chat. And after Representative McGarvey, we're going to have Reed Maki go through several different legislative initiatives and then start talking about international issues after we talk about the domestic slate. Thank you, Representative McGarvey.
Thanks so much, Judy. And, obviously I'm going to echo a lot of the comments that have been made already today. Appreciate Rep. Skolton and her leadership on this issue in particular. This is a lack of political will, right? This is a problem we can solve. This is a problem where we can really make a difference in children's lives, but we've got to have the political will to do it. We've got to have the enforcement mechanisms and the funding for those enforcement mechanisms. We've got to make sure that our laws are protected. We've got to make sure we're talking about this in a real way. The statistics are damning, right? We see the 31% increase. We see these things, but those are just numbers. I think we need to talk about the real impact of what this does. It was just 2 years ago in my hometown in Louisville, Kentucky, that 2 10-year-olds were found at 2 a.m. working in McDonald's. They were working the cash registers. They were distributing food. They were keeping the place open. One of them was allowed to use the fryer at 10 years old. I have twins going into the 8th grade right now and a 1st grader at my house. The 1st grader is actually pretty self-sufficient, but one of the twins, I'm not sure I want cooking eggs right now, much less operating a fryer at a McDonald's at 2 a.m. in the morning. This is the type of thing, it is so incredible, but it's happening all the time. And I just heard on the Zoom talking about like child labor law is not something from 100 years ago. It's happening today. Even the term child labor, it seems like from a bygone era. And I think we have to wake people up to the fact this is happening and that we have policymakers who are actually looking at rolling back some of the existing protections instead of strengthening them. Look at what happened in Florida. Florida lawmakers, they're advancing legislation to allow children as young as 14 to work overnight shifts. And I say this with 2 kids who are going to be 14 here soon. That is not what 8th and 9th grade students should be doing. They should not be working overnight shifts. They should be preparing for a life where maybe they have to work overnight shifts, but they've got to be getting ready for that, developing appropriately, and this is dangerous for kids. Look in Indiana, just the state to my north. They are looking at rolling back protections on really dangerous agricultural jobs for 16 and 17-year-olds. I get this. I'm from Kentucky. I'm from an agricultural state, but there are jobs that are too dangerous for kids to be working. We know in every other aspect of their lives that they're not developmentally ready to do things. They shouldn't be developmentally ready to do these types of dangerous jobs. We've got to make sure we have legislation like the Power Act. We've got to make sure that advocates and parents and schools and teachers are coming together and talking about this. Communities are talking about this. Elected leaders are talking about this. We've got to make sure that businesses know they cannot profit from doing this. Our laws have to have a stiff enough penalty in them that a business owner is not just afraid to get caught, they're afraid to ever do it in the first place. And so I appreciate the work you all are doing on this. It really is something that is not a past problem, it's a current problem, and it's a problem we can solve if we have people doing it. So appreciate what you guys are doing.
Thank you, Representative McGarvey. We're delighted that you've joined as a co-lead of the task force. We liked working with your office so much last session that we actually advocated for your co-leadership, and we're lobbying Trevor and others to make it happen. So thank you very much. Yeah, I'm just going to provide a quick overview of some of the good bills that we like in the current Congress. We saw a lot in the last session, and one of the purposes of this meeting is to get additional co-sponsors on good legislation. So we're hoping that the staffers that are listening will take notes and follow up with us, and we can move from there. So our first speaker is a staffer I know really well. Bob Schull is a senior counsel with the Ed and Workforce Committee, and he is fantastic. And he wrote 2 child labor bills last year with his boss, Representative Bobby Scott, and he's going to talk about them right now.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for that introduction, Reed. It was very generous, and I hope to deserve it. So anyway, hi, I'm Bob Schull, and I work with the Education and Workforce Committee, Democratic staff. And I don't need to repeat for you about the surge in identified child labor violations. But I'll sort of set the stage of what we were confronting in the last Congress. One was that states were pulling back from the business of protecting children. Something like 18 states since 2021 have enacted rollbacks of one form or another. And one of the things that that does is it increases the risk of actual child labor. For example, there's research that shows that parental authorization requirements reduce the risk of child labor. What did Arkansas roll back? A state law requiring parental notification and authorization for employment. It also increases the risk because of employer confusion. Employers, especially small employers, want to know what the law is. And if they are told, especially by their trade associations, that their state law around child labor has changed, some of them may take that to be the only rules they have to comply with. And so there have been cases where kids have been employed in jobs that they were not allowed to work under federal rules, but the employers will just charitably say we're confused by weakening in their states. Setting all of that aside, ultimately, when the states roll back, they shift more responsibility onto the federal government to do all of that extra work of enforcing child labor laws. Unfortunately, that is happening at a time when federal capacity has been weakened and is on a path to get even weaker. The Wage and Hour Division is our key agency for setting the rules and enforcing them around child labor, down, as we heard, to 611 investigators as of last month. I just want to note that since fiscal year 2020, every single year, in inflation-adjusted dollars, Wage and Hour Division's budget fell until fiscal year 2025, when it finally went up above the 2020 level. The budget proposal for FY26 would bring it down by close to 10%, which would bring it down below, in inflation-adjusted terms, fiscal year 2020. Anytime the budget is held flat or cut, we know that the Wage and Hour Division is going to have to end up either losing staff or losing experience and expertise, because staff costs don't shrink. And that's just the unfortunate fact. So we know that this is on a path to get weaker. The Project 2025 roadmap for the Trump administration included a call for rolling back the Wage and Hour Division's hazardous occupation orders, the orders that identify which jobs are too hazardous for children to be legally permitted to work. The author of that chapter is Jonathan Berry, who has been nominated to run to be the Solicitor of Labor. Solicitor of Labor's office is the second really key agency dedicated to protecting children. They are the litigators who go in to court when the Wage and Hour Division finds cases that need to be pursued. Meanwhile, the Wage and Hour Division, not only is its leadership weakening, perhaps, in commitment to protecting children, their actual staff capacity is weakening. There were scores of Wage and Hour or Solicitor's Office attorneys who left as a result of the fork in the road inducements to shrink the federal staffing, and their budget has not been supported well over the last several years on top of that. Another way that we're weakening our federal capacity is on the research side. There was a surge in research around child labor and illness and injury on the job in the 90s and in the early 2000s. And that's been steadily shrinking. The hub of that research was NIOSH, the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health, which is housed in the Department of Health and Human Services. Their work is now basically one grant on illness and injury of children in agriculture. And that is even in question now because of the mass reductions in force at HHS, and the current HHS budget proposal, which would eliminate entirely that area of work of NIOSH for not only researching children's illness and injury, but really doing most research on occupational illness and injury. Now that brings me to a sort of second area, which sometimes goes unspoken in child labor conversations, and that's workplace health and safety. One of the reasons Hannah Dreyer's expose really hits so hard with so many of us is that she documented really horrible working conditions that children were facing in jobs they should not have been allowed to work with in the beginning. So we had children on roofs falling because they weren't in harnesses that were not provided to them by their employer, even though they should have been. Even the children in the snack chip factory plant had lung irritation because of the dusts in the air. Now, this really underscores that children were in jobs that were already unsafe for everybody else. And those jobs could have been becoming even less safe for adults because these children were in the job, and these children were clearly much more expendable to the employers. So OSHA, like the Solicitor of Labor, like the Wage and Hour Division, has also been suffering budget cuts and RIFs and would be losing additional capacity in the Trump administration's budget. So what are we doing at the Education and Workforce Committee? First is the Protecting Children Act, which was just reintroduced today by Representative Scott, ranking member of the committee, and Representative Omar, who is the ranking member of the Workforce Protections Subcommittee. The Protecting Children Act tries to address our capacity collectively in terms of research and in enforcement, tries to disincentivize violations by significantly increasing both child labor violation penalties and violations for workplace health and safety standards if children are harmed as a result. The committee is also really eager and willing to provide support to other members of the caucus. I work for the committee. I respond ultimately to Ranking Member Scott. His directive to us was to help other members of the Democratic caucus. The very first member that I got the chance to work with was Representative Skolton, because she was the very first member to reach out to Mr. Scott to say that she wanted to do something. We've worked behind the scenes with her office, with former Representative Kilde's office, and with Representative McGarvey's office, who wrote a bill I was very jealous that I didn't come up with the ideas for. Really smart ideas for improving capacity at the Wage and Hour Division of the Solicitor's Office. We're also working on oversight. We've issued multiple letters demanding answers from the Department of Labor, from HHS about what's happening to NIOSH, and the GAO is going to be doing a pretty comprehensive assessment, which will be beginning soon. So I will stop there and I'll stick around for the question portion.
Bob, thank you so much. That was really, really helpful. We're going to turn now to Hannah Marsh, who we've been working with as a staffer for the Child Labor Prevention Task Force. And Hannah's going to talk about a bill that Representative Skolton has introduced or will introduce.
Hi there. All right. Thank you, Reed. Hi, everyone. My name's Hannah Marsh. I'm one of the Congresswoman's legislative assistants, and I cover immigration, labor, and education, and a few other issues for my boss. So the Congresswoman in her first term last Congress introduced a bill called the Justice for Exploited Children Act, and it would raise civil penalties for child labor violations. So we are in the process of reintroducing that bill, and this for this Congress, we're trying to revamp it a bit. And so it will increase both civil and criminal penalties for child labor violations. And kind of the thought behind this, and Bob and others on this call have kind of touched on it, but the penalties for breaking a lot of these or for violating a lot of these provisions, some of these have stayed stagnant, or the deterrents for breaking child labor laws, aren't necessarily that aren't always that conducive to other businesses. And so sometimes like a $10,000 fine is kind of a drop in the bucket for a lot of companies. So this bill increases the maximum civil and criminal penalties for violations. It also expands the range of monetary penalties for some offenses, just kind of to acknowledge the fact that there are some businesses that are violating child labor laws and they don't know it. They're not trying to violate these provisions. And so the idea is that, maybe the first violation is a mistake and you do, have consequences for that. But upon a repeated or a willful violation, those penalties would double, trying to deter businesses who might be demonstrating a pattern of neglect in that sense. So we are hoping to reintroduce this bill soon. And honestly, just really want to thank our partners at the Child Labor Coalition. Reed has been so helpful to our office, and Bob as well on the committee. We really appreciate all the help that you've given us on this bill. And also thank you to our co-chair partners in Rep. McGarvey's office. We are looking forward to working with everyone on the call to continue advocating for this issue. It's a really important one, and the Congresswoman is ready to carry on that fight with you all. So thank you.
Thank you, Hannah. So I was going to highlight 4 bills, 2 that we like and 2 that we don't like, that are either introduced or about to be introduced. But in the interest of time, I think I'm just going to tell you about one of those. And for the others, we will follow up on Monday to all of the email addresses and share that list of bills, because we would really love to see many offices co-sponsor them. The bill I wanted to mention to you is out of Representative DeLauro's office, and it's a bill that would ban child labor in U.S. tobacco, which I think most Americans don't realize, that kids are working in tobacco farms. And because of gaps in U.S. child labor law, they're allowed to do that at age 12. So, to get that straight, in the U.S., you have to be 21 to buy cigarettes. But at 12, you can work in a tobacco field for 8 or 10 hours a day. And some of the kids do. And it's a very toxic crop. We see, well, you have the picture in front of you now. That's a Human Rights Watch picture of a teen tobacco worker, and she's wearing a black plastic garbage bag because the consequences of getting the nicotine on your skin are so grave. The kids, they vomit, they faint, they get dizzy. One teen advocate that we had at a press conference said it makes you feel like you're going to die. So it's really pretty nasty. And there's increasing evidence that kids are absorbing just a lot of nicotine, and there may be long-term consequences in addition to the short-term consequences. So the Children Don't Belong in Tobacco Farms bill has been around for a little while. It has a companion bill in the Senate, and it's a very simple bill. And we think voters will get it. The constituents, the folks that members represent will understand that tobacco is a crop that has killed millions and millions of people, and kids, 12-year-olds, should not be working on tobacco farms. So let's see, I have the bill number here in front of me. Anyways, I do have it somewhere, but I can't find it at the moment, and I will send that to everybody in the follow-up on Monday. So I think we can move on I'll hand it back to Judy, who's going to pass it along.
Thank you, Reed. And the Campaign to End U.S. Child Labor has been putting the links in the chat for these bills. And Reed, thank you for your persistence and leadership on the tobacco issue. It is just one of the most bitter ironies in this country. The the next phase of this masterclass, as I'm calling it, we're going to turn to the international issues. And I'm really happy to introduce Charity Ryerson to kick off this session. Charity is the founding executive director of Corporate Accountability Lab. And I think Cal has been one of the leaders in trying to use a lot of the different tools that the US government has for fighting child labor and forced labor. So we're going to ask Charity to give everybody an overview of how that works and how US leadership has resulted in these tools, or at least it's a good showcase of that leadership. Thank you, Charity.
Great. Thanks, Judy. Thanks to everybody who organized this. What a great opportunity to spotlight this very important issue. So my organization, Corporate Accountability Lab, uses the law to promote the human rights of individuals and communities that are harmed in global supply chains. So I want to speak briefly to the legal frameworks in the US for addressing the child labor issue globally, and give you a sense of how we and other CSOs are kind of using these tools. So between 2019 and 2023, my organization conducted a series of investigations into child labor trafficking and forced labor in the cocoa sector in Cote d'Ivoire and Nigeria. Surprising no one, we found that hazardous child labor was very common. And while less common, we did find numerous instances of forced child labor. These kids, who are often the same age as my own kids, 10, 11, 12, sometimes younger, are working with machetes, and they're applying pesticides to these cocoa pods that are as big as their heads. So we gathered all this evidence, and when CSOs like ours have this evidence, what can we use? What tools are available to us here in the United States? So one statute that does a lot of the heavy lifting in this space is the Trafficking Victims Prevention Reauthorization Act, TVPRA. Among other things, this law directs ILAB to maintain the list of goods produced by child and forced labor, as well as the State Department's TIP reports. These are both incredible resources. And the statute provides both civil and criminal liability provisions for overseas trafficking. So we took some of this evidence that we gathered in West Africa. We submitted our evidence to ILAB for the child and forced labor list and to the State Department for the TIP report. Some of that information, particularly the information around trafficking routes between Mali and Burkina Faso and Togo into Cote d'Ivoire, was reflected in those reports. These kinds of reports by the US government have a wide variety of uses, including providing key data to support both government and civil society in designing effective interventions to address child labor. These also put companies on notice of human rights risks in their supply chains, which is obviously very important. Now, regarding the liability provisions in the TVPRA, civil TVPRA suits filed by minor victims of trafficking are not uncommon, both for domestic and international child trafficking. Child victims of forced labor in cobalt mines, the DRC, and from the Ivorian cocoa sector have brought civil claims under the TVPRA in recent years. But these claims are still pending, and we'll have to see whether or not they're going to prevail under the legal standards. But another area under the TVPRA where more activity would be really welcome is enforcement of the criminal provisions. So despite having the legal authority to do so, the US government has actually never prosecuted a company for forced child labor abroad. There's lots of evidence, but that hasn't resulted in prosecutions. We have seen some increased efforts in this space. We've seen encouraging collaboration between CBP and HSI and DOJ on a number of cases in this area. We just haven't seen any charges filed, so that's some room for improvement. Another key statute to highlight is Section 307 of the Tariff Act of 1930. This is the import ban. It bans the importation of forced labor produced goods, which includes forced child labor. So going back to our West Africa investigations, we've also submitted some of that child trafficking evidence to the Forced Labor Division at U.S. Customs and Border Protection, which is tasked with overseeing that statute. But to be clear, U.S. law doesn't prohibit the importation or sale of goods produced with general child labor or hazardous child labor, only forced child labor. But that said, CBP has played a really important role in penalizing and deterring child labor trafficking through this statute, and it remains a really key tool. And then, one other way to think about our accountability framework here, in addition to harming children themselves, the flow of child labor produced goods into the United States also presents unfair competition with the companies that are trying to do well. It harms consumers who are unwittingly purchasing these goods. So the Federal Trade Commission has a role to play here, as well as consumer lawsuits. We used some of our hazardous child labor evidence from West Africa in a consumer protection suit targeting a major chocolate company and a certifier, Rainforest Alliance. Now, some of you might be thinking, certification, isn't this part of the way that we combat child labor? We would say that in our experience in the field, certified and uncertified farms are largely identical from an environmental and human rights standpoint. So many of these farms where we found child labor, including trafficked children, were certified farms. We did settle this lawsuit, and the company removed the Rainforest Alliance label from their products. So that seemed like a success for protecting consumers from false information. We've also sued a leading acai company related to the use of child labor in Brazilian acai supply chains that is also certified. So these kinds of consumer protection cases and action by the FTC can help protect consumers from inadvertently purchasing products produced with child labor and can help level the playing field for companies who are following the law. Two quick final points on the two agencies that are really key here, CBP's Forced Labor Division and iLab. Both of these have been kind of front and center in this fight. On CBP, I think we just want to emphasize that it is really important to maintain the independence of agencies that are tasked with enforcing these laws. CBP has played this really important role, but recent events at the Forced Labor Division have raised some important questions about their ability to do this in the current political context and to do it in a way that is appropriately protective of this highly vulnerable population. In addition to our concerns about sort of non-discriminatory application of this statute in this context, we also have some reason for concern about the agency's current ability to protect confidential information that could identify vulnerable children and potentially put them in harm's way. So I just want to reiterate, the Forced Labor Division has done incredible work in this space, but it's really important that it's able to maintain its independence to continue to credibly fulfill this mandate. And then finally, I know iLab is going to be covered in more detail by other speakers, but I just want to flag the unique role that iLab has played in combating child labor abroad. We all know that no single intervention is going to solve child labor, and in particular for family-based child labor, the programs that iLab has historically funded are much more fit for purpose than criminal liability or an import ban. They are funding this kind of on-the-ground work with those who are directly impacted by child labor. It is slow, it is difficult, but it is vitally important. And so alongside these blunter tools that I've been describing that are available, iLab's sensitive and sophisticated work in this area is really essential if we have any hope of making progress on this issue. Judy, I'll pass it back to you. Thanks.
Thank you, Charity. That was amazing. I think somebody's going to have to download that and use that in their thesis research, because you covered a lot of ground really quickly. Super helpful. And I think it makes it really clear that the US has this legal infrastructure. It's quite amazing legal infrastructure. iLab is at the center of that. And I like this sensitive and sophisticated framing that you put on them, because it really is. They're playing a diplomatic role. I want to pick up on how corporations use that information and turn it over to our next two speakers, who I want to introduce together, because Sadiksha, sorry, I've lost my place. Sadiksha Nepal from Goodweave. And Goodweave, I've loved Goodweave for a long time, and I know you do certifications, but you do community-based deep interventions on child labor. So I really want to make that distinction. And then after Sadiksha, we're going to have Elizabeth Fay from Verite. Verite is also doing deeper interventions. And I think the work that you've been doing, and much of it supported by iLab, has been a part of that sensitive and sophisticated work that Charity was pointing to, in terms of your ability to get to the field, both work with companies and communities. So please tell us more about your work and how it's being affected right now.
Sure. I think my story is a little bit more personal and professional, both at the same time. I am currently the Director of Advocacy and Communications at Goodweave International here in Washington, D.C. And like you mentioned, we do a lot of community-based work, a lot of rehabilitation, a lot of mapping and monitoring in the supply chains. And I'm very, very thankful to Goodweave, because I found a professional home here. They were able to see the passion that I bring for this job, the passion that I bring to combat child labor in the supply chain, because a couple of months ago, I was actually at iLab. I was their Senior International Relations Specialist. I covered the South Asia region, doing research and policy work in the Office of Child Labor, Forced Labor, and Human Trafficking. And it was to ensure that government, businesses, and the public were aware of child and forced labor risks in their supply chain. ILAB was an incredible place to work. It had historically worked with governments to safeguard rights of children and workers through trade agreements, collecting important data on child and forced labor, and help businesses improve labor rights. These systems not only protected children abroad, but they also protected American workers from unfair competition and exploitative labor abroad. You know, it was really difficult to watch DOGE earlier this year cancel several of our programs because a lot of work had gone into building that, a lot of relationships with governments, with communities and workers that have been eroded like that, it feels like. The termination of these grants not only means increased child and forced labor across the globe, but it also erodes labor protections at home. It undermines working conditions in a global way. Programs that address child and forced labor, they are in fact America First programs, and I do want to highlight that. You know, a couple of months ago, when my colleagues and we took the deferred resignation that came a second time around, we were very proud of serving the American public. It was very, very hard work. We were already incredibly short-staffed, but our work mattered to the American public, and it mattered what we were doing. Our work had direct impact on workers in the US and beyond. Since coming to GoodWeave, I've witnessed what advocacy for this work looks like from outside of the government, to protect children in our global supply chain, and also to advocate for my friends who are still at ILAB. I'm in direct communication with them now, and so my job here is not only to talk about, like, you know, the work that is suffering because of the funding cuts that are happening at ILAB, the rescission bill that was introduced today that is going to take money away from Department of Labor, but to also highlight the incredible amount of institutional knowledge that has been lost from the U.S. government. I know folks who have left the department did not do so with free will. For months, we were subjected to terror and intimidation, and you know, we knew that a reduction in force was coming, which likely meant loss of our jobs and our livelihoods. It was an incredibly, tremendously difficult decision to make, and I know that people who made the decision to leave did not make it lightly. Almost 40% of ILAB staff took the deferred resignation. The involuntary exit has meant incredible amount of knowledge lost, incredible amount of years of building relationships lost. And those who are left behind, I want to speak on behalf of my colleagues who are still there. Like, they're overstretched, they're under capacity, and they're burnt out emotionally and with the work, because we were already so short-staffed, and now we have so much more work to do, so much more congressionally mandated work to do, and we need the resources to do so, both financial and both human. So this is, I guess, a plea for children all over the world, and in particular today, when the ILO numbers have come out that said there are 138 million children worldwide in child labor. The moment is now to fund more projects at ILAB, to fund ILAB, and not to take money away from a place that has stood at the forefront of addressing child and forced labor in our global supply chains. And with that, I'll turn it back to Elizabeth, actually.
Thank you so much, Sadiksha, and thank you for joining us, Elizabeth.
Thank you both. And it's so wonderful to be with this group of really talented individuals today, talking about something that's so critically important on this World Day Against Child Labor. So a little bit about Verite. We're a US-based international not-for-profit organization that has been a leader in supply chain social responsibility for the past 30 years. We collaborate directly with the private sector and governments to drive systemic change in preventing labor exploitation in global supply chains. Forced labor and child labor are endemic in global supply chains. Before you even reached the office today, there was a high probability that you were an unwitting consumer of goods made wholly or in part with forced and/or child labor. You may have checked your email on your smartphone, drank your morning coffee, put on your shoes and clothing, and hopped in a car to work. All of these goods have supply chains tainted with exploitative labor. iLab's work is crucial in understanding and addressing child labor and forced labor. Their efforts help us comprehend the scope and nature of these labor abuses and how they impact the goods that Americans purchase. iLab plays a very critical role, and Charity had mentioned this in her previous comments, on the U.S. trade agenda on forced labor with its technical assistance and capacity building activities, helping our trading partners strengthen their labor systems, which is essential in stopping the exploitation of children and workers in supply chains. Verite has been a longtime partner of iLab, working on initiatives such as training labor inspectors in West Africa on forced labor indicators, developing tools to help companies to leverage technology to trace labor abuses in their supply chains, and building the capacity of local labor inspectors in coffee supply chains in Latin America. On March 26th, the administration terminated the entire iLab grant portfolio, which has provided key U.S. leadership and technical assistance in addressing labor abuses around the world. This action impacted roughly $500 million in grants, of which $237 million were outstanding commitments to dozens of organizations for ongoing and awarded work. This unprecedented cancellation was abrupt. These were not non-renewal notices. They were immediate stop work orders for projects that had been solicited by the DOL and competitively awarded. Work that was actively being carried out in the field was halted. At Verite, we were significantly impacted. 5 programs led by Verite and 2 programs where we played a supporting role were immediately terminated. Millions of dollars in contracted revenue disappeared overnight, forcing us to make unexpected staff layoffs, nearly 30%. We had to leave critical programs, trainings, and research unfinished, despite US taxpayers' investment. Many organizations were not as fortunate as Verite. Their cuts have had catastrophic impact. Some organizations scaling back their labor portfolios or even eliminating completely, being forced to make staff cuts 50% in order to keep the organization afloat, or even some left with great uncertainty about their future existence. To add insult to injury, many organizations are now being challenged and denied reimbursement for work and expenses incurred prior to the March 26 termination notices. The loss of iLab funding will be devastating for workers and children in countries in supply chains where the capacity to enforce labor laws are weak. It will result in unchecked exploitation, forced labor, and childhoods cut short. On this World Day Against Child Labor, we ask Congress to support iLab and its grant portfolio. American consumers do not want to unwittingly aid the exploitation of children, nor should American workers compete with goods produced with forced or child labor. We urge you to champion iLab and its grant program in the budget and appropriations process. And thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth, so much for really summing up the impact that iLab and the termination of its grants have had. My name is Anjali Kocher, and I am part of the campaign to end U.S. child labor. And it falls to me to actually close out this master class, as Judy has really very aptly dubbed this briefing today. There are a couple of points that have really kind of risen up for me as I have heard all the speakers, and I'm sure that there are quite a number of impactful points for all of you out there that have been shared today. But first, let me start by thanking Representative Skolton and Representative McGarvey and their teams for really all of the work that they have been doing in the Congress through the Congressional Child Labor Prevention Task Force, and really working so closely with committee staff like Bob, but also with all of the civil society partners that we have here on the briefing today, from the Child Labor Coalition to Global March Against Child Labor, and all of the other organizations that are here and represented. We started today at the top of the briefing with Judy mentioning that in the last 20 plus years, we've seen this decrease in child labor by more than 100 million children. And this is obviously progress that we must celebrate. We must take a moment and actually acknowledge the incredible amount of work that has been done over these past 20 plus years. But it didn't happen, right? Because somebody waved some magic wand and said, okay, poof, there we go. We've reduced the number. It is because we collectively have the tools and we collectively have the knowledge on what works. And so, I think in this day and age, there are many things for all of us to be thinking about, many issues that are pulling us in different directions. But I want to come back to a point that actually Jessica made in her remarks, which is afterwards, it's too late. There are policies in place today that as they are being rolled out will have an impact on child labor here in the United States. And we have to be very clear about that. And we also must feel the urgency to be thinking ahead, to be looking down the line and trying to put things into place that will help us stop and protect the children that are in this country and around the world. And so with that, I just want to say, all of us have a role to play, right? There are many things that we can all do, as we've heard today. There are all sorts of programs that are on the ground. There are levers at the disposal of government to be having an impact, that can be pushed to have an impact. And there are, the success that we have seen so far is because of the work of communities, because of the work of civil society organizations, because of companies that have stood up, and because of what government has said that they will do and have committed to doing. So today, on World Day Against Child Labor, when we have 138 million child laborers still in this world, with some here in the United States, really what we need to do is remember what government can do, what Congress has the power to do. And so we will leave you with this one thought. We've talked about some proposed bills. We've talked about bills that may be coming and introduced soon. We really ask that congressional offices, that representatives stand with children and protect children. So please consider asking your member to co-sponsor some of these bills. Please consider joining the Congressional Child Labor Task Force. And please think about really doing whatever you can, talking about it, because the Child Labor Coalition has an incredible list of child labor champions. And so you too could be part of that list. But thank you all so much for being here, for hanging in with us as we went 3 minutes over, and for doing all that you do to really protect children every day in whatever your role is that you play. Thank you.